Policy Beyond Borders. Welcome to Policy Beyond Borders, a podcast series on geopolitics and international relations by Center for Public Policy Research, CPPR, where we bring to you podcasts with insightful discussions and newer perspectives on a wide range of topics of contemporary relevance with experts to discuss, deconstruct, and advocate for things that matter. Podcast episodes of Policy Beyond Borders by CPPR are on Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and on cppr.in.
Hello everyone, this is Neelima, Associate Research from Center for Public Policy Research. This is our third episode of Policy Beyond Borders, and in this edition, we are delving into the analysis of Presidential Election of Maldives, which has great geopolitical implications in international relations. When the world is busy discussing G20 and its outcomes, here we bring to you this important issue in which India's take couldn't be missed. Tune in and let's get started. The archipelago nation went for historic polls on 9 September 2023 with 8 candidates contesting for election. The main political parties in the Maldives are the Maldivian Democratic Party, which was the ruling party and supports democracy, human rights, and closer ties with India, the Progressive Party of Maldives, which is the main opposition party and favors closer relations with China, the People's National Congress, which is a splinter group from the PPM and supports former President Abdul, the Jamhuri Party, which advocates for economic development, social welfare, and constitutional reforms, and the Democrats, which is a newly formed party that claims to represent the middle ground between India and the PPM. The political landscape of Maldives is also greatly influenced by external factors such as geopolitics of the Indian Ocean, where both India and China have a stake in the outcome of the election. Today, I am joined by Mr. Mimrah Gafoor, an independent Maldivian political analyst. He's experienced in foreign policy analysis, governance, anti-corruption, and English speech writing and editing. Most recently, he worked as a lead speech writer to the President of the General Assembly at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Welcome to Policy Beyond Borders, Mr. Mimrah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting me.
Yeah. So looking at the situation where no candidate has achieved a majority of 50% plus votes in the initial round of the election on September 9th, the election has now proceeded to a runoff scheduled for September 30th. This was also highlighted by you in your article in Diplomat titled Maldives Presidential Election is a multi-horse race. Following the tallying of votes, during which a total of 2,25,486 votes were cast, Muizzu emerged as a frontrunner with 1,01,635 votes, equivalent to 46.06% of the total. In contrast, President Ibrahim Saleh, despite his recent generous initiatives during his time in power, received only 86,161 votes, which is equal to 39.05% of the vote. In the third position is Ilyas Labib, acting as a proxy candidate for Mohammed Nasheed, with 77.18% of votes, according to the information provided by the Election Commission. So, as a political analyst, what is your assessment of the potential outcome of the runoff election, which is scheduled for September 30th?
I think that at this point in time, the opposition candidate is the front runner, and he has reason to be cautiously optimistic. I think it took a lot of analysts by surprise as well, because realistically, the government had been campaigning on the momentum of winning this election in one round. That turned out not to be the case, and I think even earlier people had predicted that, despite that campaign rhetoric, that was very unlikely to materialize because of the sheer number of candidates. But the smart money, quote unquote, thus far had always been on President Saleh, who taken the plurality vote, and Mohammed Muizzu maybe coming in second. So this definitely comes as a surprise to the government, and it definitely puts them in a worse footing than the opposition in the run-up to September 30th. Now, I think a big part of this has to do with the rift between former President Nasheed and President Saleh, because the Democrats, as you mentioned, they are essentially a breakaway faction of the MDP. They broke off after Mohammed Nasheed unsuccessfully contested against Solihu in the MDP primary. And rather than reconciling, they have maintained their differences. And if you look at the numbers of the votes cast for Ilyas Labib, they are numerically commensurate with the amount of votes that Mohammed Nasheed received in the MDP primary, which is around 15,000. So I think had the MDP had stood firm and they hadn't become factionalized, that 39, that 7% would have gone to President Solihu in the first round. I also think it's a miscalculation by the government in the run up to the election, because one of the Speaker Mohammed Nasheed's grievances against the government is that their reliance on a coalition, the coalition that brought them into power in 2018. I think by favoring that coalition over maintaining unity within the MDP party, that has cost the government a lot of votes. It's also, for better or for worse, I think the opposition's campaign has been quite effective. They have been campaigning on an India Out platform, as you have mentioned, and I don't think that the government PR machinery has been particularly effective in countering that, because for one thing, I think they neglect to mention enough that Yamin himself actually maintained an India first foreign policy. And Dr. Mohammed Muizzu, the PNC candidate, he is also committed to an India first foreign policy. I don't think that will change. And I think a lot of that campaign is insincere and essentially to rile up nationalist public sentiment. And it seems to have worked in the opposition's favor, and the government has not done a particularly effective job of countering that rhetoric. Another point that I think it's important to highlight is you mentioned the Jamhuri Party. They received essentially less than they received about 2.5% of the vote share this time, which is historically an extremely low showing for Qasim Ibrahim, who was once a major political figure in his own right. In the 2013 elections, in the first round, he managed to garner 20%, or around that much, and he was neck and neck with Yamin in terms of being able to proceed to the second round. And he has historically been a very powerful kingmaker in our politics. And that's why the government maintained a coalition with the JP up until this point. That does not seem to be the case anymore. It seems that Mohammed Nasheed with his Democrats are much more in the kingmaker position, because without their vote, it's extremely unlikely that Ibrahim Mohammed Saleh can succeed in the second round. And even having said that, the government's position is actually quite dangerous, because Mohammed Muizzu, he was able to secure 46% of the vote. He does not necessarily need all of the Democrats' votes to get him past that 50% plus one voter threshold to be able to secure the presidency. So I think he has a broader selection of people that he can make a coalition if he so chooses to, whereas the government definitely needs the Democrats to align with them, and thus far the indication is that that may not necessarily be the case. I think the split between Ibrahim Solihu and Mohammed Nasheed is quite strong. It has political elements in it. It has personal elements in it. And to be fair, I also don't think this election is entirely being decided by foreign policy alone. This government was elected on a very strong mandate of anti-corruption, and there's a lot of domestic issues that they have not perhaps done the best job in terms of delivering on. Because Yamin's presidency was extremely scandal ridden. I don't know if you recall the MNPRC corruption scandal in his administration, where leases to islands were done through an illicit and extremely uh, unethical bidding process, and it was used to essentially launder money. And Solio's administration was very much elected as part of a backlash to that politics of corruption, as well as to the kind of autocracy and that characterized Yamin's regime, and as well as the turmoil that characterized his regime. Solio has done better in terms of not imprisoning all of his political opponents. This is a competitive election, and I do think that that remains a milestone for our democracy. But at the same time, the Solio administration has also been plagued by a lot of corruption scandals, including a corruption scandal relating to the procurement of ventilators during the COVID-19 crisis, and that's cost him a lot of votes. And I think a combination of him not being able to deliver on his initial pledges, again, to reiterate, one of which was zero tolerance to corruption, as well as a very effective opposition anti-campaign, has worked in the opposition's favor. That being said, while the opposition does remain in a stronger position, and Muizzu is the front runner in the elections now, there's still a 3-week window before the next the second round will take place. And in politics, 3 weeks is a very long time, and we will see whether the government will learn from the mistakes that they made leading up to the campaign, which side, how the political spectrum is aligned in the lead up to the election. And I think it will be a closer race than what it was perhaps in the first round, but it's very difficult to predict.
Thank you so much. You, as a political analyst, you have highlighted an important part of this election. That is the split of the MDP has actually caused them a lot of votes, and also this election is not entirely decided by the foreign policy alone, but also the domestic issues of the Maldives as well. So coming to our next question, that is, even though Ibrahim Saleh has done major improvements, as you have mentioned, his government has poor record on governance in terms of corruption and religious violence in island nations, as you have mentioned in the procurement of ventilators during the COVID-19, the corruption case. So even during the first round, he has only gained 39.05%, which we have discussed earlier, compared to Muizzu from Yamin's party. So, and Muizzu's one of the main agenda was like limiting India's presence in Maldives, which is like expelling a small group of Indian military personnel stationed in the archipelago. So, considering all this, does the initial result mean that the people of Maldives actually want to side against India? I mean, I want to highlight the people's opinion on this. And also, I would like to know, will this be a future challenge for India in Maldives? Because in several articles authored by you have also mentioned the concerns regarding the Maldives election, where you have highlighted the challenge of Maldives will be in skillfully managing its relationship with both India and China. So looking ahead, on the other part, is it expected that Maldives will uphold a diplomatic position when engaging with India and China, or could the nation potentially align more closely with one of these countries depending upon the election outcome?
For one thing, I would take campaign rhetoric with a grain of salt. So even while the PPM they are campaigning on an India out campaign, my intuition, this is my own personal intuition, is that they will temper that rhetoric. Because looking back at the Yamin administration, which would be the example that we can draw data from, he, as I mentioned earlier, he maintained an India first foreign policy. Not only that, he implored our media not to use overly inflammatory language towards India, and he tried to maintain a good relationship with India, as evidenced by the fact that India was the first country to which he took an official visit. And during the 2014 water crisis, when we had water cut off, sorry, we had a technical issue with our ability to access water in the capital. He certainly had no qualms about receiving assistance and aid from India to manage that crisis. It was later on in his term, as his political footing became more unstable, and as India was criticizing him for imprisoning certain political opponents, that he started to take a more nationalist stance. And I think that was to bolster his domestic standing. Keep in mind that the Dornier aircraft that the PPM, PNC, they're complaining about now, they were initially leased to the Maldives under his administration. The dockyard in Utturu Tilafalu, it's also proceeding under defense agreements made bilaterally between India and Maldives under the Yamin administration. And similarly, even with to take the converse parallel, when the MDP government, they were in the opposition, they made a lot of remarks about how the Maldives is too dependent on China, how we have our debt obligation to China is soaring, and that China will lead us to debt traps. But upon assuming office, they have actually maintained fairly robust commercial relations with China. China is still upgrading our international airport in Velana, in Hulule. They're proceeding with building housing units in Hulumale. They renovated our foreign ministry building. And we have ongoing projects with China. We receive Chinese officials, and there's a lot of bilateral visits between the two countries. So I sometimes think that this dichotomy that the Maldives is always wavering between India and China is too stark, and I think there's a lot of domestic considerations, domestic political drivers that get left aside in the discourse. As I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of the backlash towards the government has more to do with their failure to effectively address corruption and maintaining an unpopular coalition, and also the factionalism within the MDP than it does specifically with India. Having said that, I do believe that there is a public sentiment that India is perhaps too overbearing on our politics. I think they're too identified with a particular political party, the MDP, and I think it creates this, at least a narrative that the MDP is subservient to India, and by extension, since this is an MDP-led government, that the government is subservient to India, and the government has not really done enough to counter that narrative. Now, if Muizzu were to be elected especially if it's on the back of an India Out campaign, I think that will hurt relations in the short term. I think they will make an effort to temper and be more diplomatic with that rhetoric once they have, or if they actually are able to secure office. But I believe that their comments in the lead up to the election will not have been received well by India, and I think that will create a lot of friction and bilateral ties. And I think if they were elected, the responsible thing to do would be to tone down that rhetoric a bit. In terms of an alignment with China, I do believe that both Muizzu and Solihu are actually capable of keeping a more diplomatic or middle ground between the two countries than often seems to be the case. But one thing that I think he would do differently is enter into a free trade agreement with China, because simply by inference, because when Yamin was president, he attempted to enter into a free trade agreement with China, and the way that he proceeded with that agreement was actually quite strange. He essentially had it forced through Parliament without a quorum, without any proper legislative discretion or scrutiny, and he managed to pass it, but he never ratified it. And the current administration has thus far been content to let it lie unratified. If a PNC government comes to power, I think they might be more amenable to signing that free trade agreement. And I do think that would give China more commercial leverage over the Maldives. But we'll just have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, thank you. So if Muizzu comes to power in short term, it is gonna hurt relations with India. And also in terms of alignment with China, a free trade agreement is actually possible, right? So right now, till now, we have discussed foreign policy challenges, etc. So when coming to domestic challenges that Maldives face, like such as youth employment and development concerns and the corruption, etc. So do you foresee any potential alleviation of these issues in the near future? And which of the candidates or political parties currently competing in the election do you believe possess the greater capability to effectively address the domestic challenges of Maldives?
To be honest, I'm quite disappointed in all the candidates with regard to that question. So I believe that both Muiz and President Solih are intelligent people who are capable of doing or advocating for responsible policies. But on the campaign trail, I think they have both given into highly populist policies, which I don't think this country is in an economic a footing to really be. Like, I don't think we're in a position where we'd be able to bear that burden, because right now the Maldives is in an extremely economically precarious situation. We COVID took a toll on our economy. We've recovered somewhat, thanks partly to the rebound in our tourism sector. Uh, but the level of debt that the country has accrued is actually quite high. I can't recall the exact figures off the top of my head, but our debt servicing is extremely high right now. And according to World Bank reports, by 2026, our debt repayment obligations cumulatively will amount to 1 billion US dollars, which is about 1/5 of our current GDP, which is approximately about $5 billion. And we have seen the kind of toll and spillover effects that a debt crisis can have on our neighbors. We've seen it in Sri Lanka, we've seen it in Pakistan, and the Maldives. Though we haven't really been plunged into that kind of crisis. Just on a number of metrics, we're actually a much more vulnerable country because we're extremely vulnerable to climate shocks. Our economy is extremely dependent on the tourism industry. Any shocks to the global air travel industry or a decline in tourism demand really hurts our economy. And thus far, the government's approach to this has been mixed. They've done some strides that have been praised by international experts, such as at the World Bank and the IMF. For instance, they raised the goods and services tax back in January to raise more government revenue, but that's also been offset by a number of measures that they've implemented subsequently, because it is a bit of a contradiction to raise the GST and then announce that we're going to also raise salaries and wages for certain professionals. And in the lead up to the election, both candidates have been making claims that are essentially not well planned out and almost absurd, and very politically expedient, and more populist than they are technically sound. For instance, the government recently announced that they will increase the public sector salary by 40% should they come to power. This really does not match with the rhetoric that they use to justify the GST increases. How can we be in such a precarious economic situation where we need to tighten our belts and do things that are economically responsible. And at the same time, we have all these extravagant funds to dispense in return for your political support. And Dr. Muizzu has also just expanded on the government's pledges. Like, for instance, they recently announced a Binveri or landowner scheme where they have provided applicants who are eligible for land in the greater Malay region with essentially real estate, a lot of which even needs to be reclaimed. But people still need capital to be able to build that real estate. And Muizzu has said he's going to set up a fund, and he's also going to essentially implement populist measures that aren't necessarily economically sound. And we also have a number of structural problems with our economy that successive governments have refused to deal with. So a big reason that we have such a high debt obligation is because of the amount of state-owned enterprises in the Maldives. A big share of our economy is essentially dependent on state-owned enterprises, all of which come with sovereign guarantees for their projects or for any loan that they take out. And successive delegations from IMF, the World Bank, and reports by them have warned us that the SOEs sector in the Maldives is far too bloated. But there's not been much will to cut it down. In fact, part of the problem is that they're used as a political tool, not just by this government, but by previous governments as well, and probably by future governments as well. Essentially, the state-owned enterprises, which the technical justification for them being there is that they are able to provide services that the private sector cannot provide, such as utilities, services, waste collection, electricity, and they're supposed to provide technical services. That's the justification for them. But so far, when we see the kinds of appointments that are made to these SOEs, they're essentially political appointments. If you are aligned with the government, they will give you well-paid sinecure positions in state-owned enterprises. And in return for that, they expect you to be involved in party activities, make up numbers for rallies. In the lead up to both the MDP primaries and the general election, we saw staffed by SOEs such as Fenaka take part in like putting up banners for the MDP. And all of this just adds to bloat, and it crowds out the private sector, and it adds to our fiscal worries. Therefore, I am quite disappointed across the spectrum in terms of how they're approaching debt, how much seriousness they give it, and I don't personally have any confidence that situation is going to change anytime soon. Having said that, I also do believe that any government that comes to power will have to look at the numbers, including most especially the looming $1 billion US dollar debt repayment that we need to make in 2026. And it's going to strike them with some alarm because just by looking at neighboring Sri Lanka, if the country goes into political turmoil simply because of an economic crisis, there's no guarantee that they'll actually be able to stay in power up until the next elections in 2028. So regardless of who comes to power, Muizzu or Solihu, I am hoping that they will look at the numbers with some trepidation, with some sense of caution, and implement more fiscally responsible and prudent measures.
Thank you so much for that insightful comment. Let's hope that whoever comes to power will address these issues carefully and in a well manner. So thank you, Mr. Mimrah, for such an engaging conversation. We have covered a lot of important aspects from a Maldivian perspective regarding the election, including the foreign policy challenges, that is balancing between India and China, and other domestic issues which Maldives will be facing and in the future. So with that, we have come to the end of this episode. Get ready for another episode that will really make you think, diving into strategically and geopolitically relevant issue across the globe. Until then, it's me, Neelima, signing off.
Listen to our podcast series, Policy Beyond Borders by CPPR, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and also on the CPPR website, www.cppr.in.